A couple of New York State legislators introduced legislation to keep the New York SAFE Act in New York City and Long Island, the areas where it tends to have a higher approval rating, but free the rest of us in upstate New York from this legislative train wreck. In response to that, our local newspaper, which just happens to be an anti-gun liberal rag, invited New Yorkers Against Gun Violence to write a guest editorial. The anti-gun organization resorted to misleading statements, half-truths, and outright lies to make their case. I know I'm as shocked as you are. Hi folks, Howard here for VP Prepping and Survival, and as I said in the open, New Yorkers Against Gun Violence was invited by our local newspaper, which is a liberal anti-gun rag, to write a guest editorial in response to this legislation. I'm not going to read the whole messed up letter to you, the editorial, but I am going to highlight a few key points that I would take exceptional exception to, because I took exception to almost the entire letter. The first says, why should our children and grandchildren be exposed to the risks of gun violence in their homes, schools, and at play? Every reliable study on this issue has demonstrated beyond dispute that more guns equals more gun violence, and that effective gun laws equates to less gun violence and fewer gun deaths in our communities. That's the first point that I want to take exception to. Where else? Their definition of effective gun laws or sensible gun laws are areas like Chicago, New York City, Detroit, areas that have the highest rates of gun violence in the country. Okay, it is not beyond dispute that where there are more guns, there is more gun violence. And more importantly, let's focus on when areas have gotten, countries, states, whatever, areas have enacted very strict gun legislation to make gun ownership almost impossible or impossible in some cases. Maybe gun violence goes down, but violent crime goes up. Is your entire point to get rid of guns, which you seem to, you're making the case that that is your point, or is it to reduce violent crime overall? Because that has not been shown to be the case anywhere. The point of contention I have is this statement. The SAFE Act has been upheld in every court that has heard a case involving the act. In fact, the U.S. Supreme Court has refused to hear an appeal of a case challenging a similar gun safety legislation in the state of Connecticut. Okay, they are factually accurate that so far the courts that have heard the cases on the SAFE Act have not overturned the SAFE Act. The problem is, what they fail to point out is these are traditionally and consistently anti-gun courts. You're talking about a court in New York State, and then you're talking about an appeals court at the federal level that is traditionally and consistently anti-gun. The idea that the Supreme Court refusing to hear this case is an indication that there are not merits to the case is utter nonsense. This was at a point, which they will fail to mention, after Justice Scalia's death. Justice Scalia, being on the court, rendered them consistently 5-4 in support of individual gun ownership rights. Under Heller and McDonald. So the idea that with him off the court, this, they're just going to magically brush that over. Well, now that Justice Gorsuch is on the court, you would expect that the ruling to come down 5-4 in favor. The reason that this case was not granted cert was not because of the anti-gun people. It was the justices that are pro-gun, pro-Second Amendment, did not want this to be granted cert because it would be decided 4-4, which would uphold at a Supreme Court level the decision of the lower court making the SAFE Act and laws like it legal. That is the only reason this didn't get heard. And look for that case out of Connecticut or a SAFE Act appeal to come before the Supreme Court now that Justice Gorsuch has been confirmed. The third thing that I wanted to take out of this letter and let you know was they said legislators are being disingenuous when they assert that the SAFE Act is overwhelmingly opposed upstate. New Yorkers, including those of us in upstate, stand strong with the 90% of Americans who support basic and common sense gun safety laws like our New York SAFE Act. First off, it is not our New York SAFE Act. Secondly, this 90% number is simply a made up and then often repeated line, like the 40% of guns used in gun crimes were picked up at the gun show through the gun show loophole. Absolute nonsense. It's been proven to be false time and time again. There is no poll that was ever taken that says 90% of people in New York State, people in the country, people anywhere. You couldn't get 90% of people in Chicago to say they support something as big a pile of crap as the SAFE Act. Secondly, as proof to my point that this is not overwhelmingly supported and it is overwhelmingly opposed here in upstate, is that outside of New York City and Long Island, nearly every county and every municipality held votes publicly to make sure that they were on the record as opposing the New York SAFE Act. Those city councils, county legislator seats, all those people all across the state, in almost every county in the state, voted publicly to acknowledge that they oppose the New York SAFE Act. So the idea that this is not widely opposed upstate is absolute nonsense, and it is complete garbage. But what would you expect from an anti-gun organization like New Yorkers Against Gun Violence? The facts simply aren't on their side, so they got to make up things wherever they can. I'm Howard for VP Prepping and Survival, exposing the lies of New Yorkers Against Gun Violence. If you like this video, click that thumbs up button. Give me a like if you would. I appreciate those. Also, check out my channel and click that little subscribe button for more videos on the Second Amendment and prepping. Remember, folks, in any survival situation, you don't just want to survive, you want to thrive. Happy shooting, everybody.